The village had never seen anything like it. In the middle of the harvest festival, when music and laughter filled the square, the air suddenly froze. Little Jabari, a boy with bright eyes and a shy smile, had slipped into the river. One moment, he was chasing a stray chicken along the edge. The next, he was swallowed by the current, flailing and gasping, his tiny hands reaching for anything that might save him. Panic rippled through the crowd like a wave, but not a single person moved. Mothers clutched their children, fathers stiffened with fear. They watched, rooted to the spot, unable or unwilling to act, except for one. Across the square, someone stirred. Someone who had long been invisible to the village, whose name had become a whisper, a cautionary tale, a shadow at the edge of every conversation. Marker, the lonely widow, felt the scream in her chest, louder than any voice around. She didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for a plan or ask for permission. She ran. She leaped. Her feet hit the muddy riverbank, and then the cold, rushing water enveloped her like a challenge and a welcome all at once. The crowd could hardly believe their eyes. The woman they had ignored, scorned, and pretended not to see was now the only one brave enough to dive into the roaring river. Arms slicing through the water, her dress clinging wetly to her frame, she reached the boy as he sank under the current, his tiny body helpless. Marker grabbed him, her own strength pulling him toward the surface. For a heartbeat, the river held them both, then gently released them back into the grasp of the bank. She emerged first, water streaming from her hair, mud coating her legs. A wild, determined fire burning in her eyes. Jabari coughed and sputtered, clinging to her, trembling but alive. No one ran to meet her, no one clapped. Only a silence heavier than before settled over the festival, a silence full of discomfort, guilt, and disbelief. How could the woman they had cast aside be the only one willing to risk everything? Their fear, their hesitation, their inaction had been exposed by her courage. Marker's act didn't bring celebration. It brought a mirror, one the village was too afraid to face. That night, Marker walked home alone. Her feet were sore, her hair tangled with mud, and her soaked clothes clung to her like a second skin. The river had not only washed the boy, but also the years of neglect and scorn she had carried. Jabari was safe, sleeping wrapped in blankets, in his mother's arms, comforted by warmth and tears that Marker herself did not receive. And yet, as she trudged up her familiar stairs, the ones that had long felt like a barrier between her and the world, something in her had shifted. Her eyes held a new light, the kind that comes from touching something both terrifying and pure, something no one else had dared to touch. The next morning, the village acted as if nothing had happened. The marketplace hummed with the same chatter, but no one greeted Marker. They walked past her silently, faces avoiding hers, whispers hiding behind polite conversation. "She's lost her mind," said one. "Jumping in for another person's child, who does that?" said another. Marker heard nothing, yet she felt every word like stones falling on her back. She continued with her day, washing clothes by the stream, selling cassava and medicinal herbs, performing the small acts that kept her alive, that kept her mind and body moving. And yet, there were moments of quiet reward. Jabari, the boy she had saved, ran to her with a tiny wildflower, thrusting it into her hands with a grin. "It's for you," he said, "because you smell like clean river." Marker knelt, smiling at him with a tenderness that had not faded despite years of loneliness. She pressed the flower between the pages of her Bible, a simple token that even in a world of scorn, innocence could recognize goodness. But beyond him, the village remained unchanged. The conversations continued without her. The laughter of the festival faded as if she had never existed. Invitations never came. Candles in the church flickered in unison, but her voice was swallowed by shadows. The silence that had defined her life returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of invisibility. It was a silence heavy with truth, a quiet that said, "I did what no one else dared." Marker had jumped. She had risked herself and emerged holding life. No words, no gratitude, no festival cheer could undo that. Even the whispers of disapproval could not erase it. In the village square, in the eyes of the skeptical and the fearful, she was no longer just a widow. She was a force, unyielding and undeniable. In the days that followed, Marker walked through the village as she always had. She bought her supplies, tended her small garden, and sold her herbs. People avoided her glance, unsure how to act in the presence of someone who had broken their invisible rules. Widows were meant to be quiet, invisible, harmless. Aging women were meant to shrink into the corners. Marker had defied it all, and the village didn't know how to respond. One afternoon, as she washed clothes by the river, two women whispered behind the bushes. "She's gone mad," one said. "A woman who throws herself into a river alone. Who does that?" Marker didn't respond. She scrubbed the clothes harder, letting her hands work, letting her mind turn indignation into quiet strength. And then there were moments that reminded her why she had jumped. Jabari's smile, his laughter, the small wildflower pressed in her Bible, the warmth of life she had returned to its mother. All these whispered that her courage had meaning, even if no one else understood. Marker returned home again and again, facing the empty yard, the silent stove, the wooden bench that had never welcomed anyone. She sat there trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of years, from the quiet injustice, from the knowledge that she had done what others could not. No one came to her door. No one brought blankets or words. The village slept as if her act were ordinary, as if saving a child were routine. But Marker knew better. What had almost drowned her was not the river. It was the long, bitter taste of being forgotten. Still, she carried on. Silence became her companion. But this silence had a new resonance. It held the truth that she had dared, that she had fought, that she had returned, holding life. In her eyes, in her heart, in the steady beat of her courage, she was no longer invisible. And even if the village could not forgive or applaud, Marker's bravery had changed something indelible, something unshakable. And that was just the beginning. In the village of Kagiso, where traditions weighed like stones and anything unexpected was met with suspicion, Marker had torn a hole in the order of things. She had dared, she had acted, she had returned. And when she reached the riverbank with Jabari in her arms, there were no words, no cheers, only the shadow of what couldn't be unseen, only the unspoken acknowledgement that she had done the impossible. The boy was safe until he opened his eyes and whispered a nearly silent thank you. Then, with her heart still warm, she stood up, adjusted the cloth at her waist, and walked home, wet, dirty, exhausted, but whole. That night, no one in the village slept the same. There was a new weight in the air, a discomfort that didn't come from the avoided tragedy, but from the unthinkable act. Because Makina's dive had revealed something no one wanted to see. That collective cowardice had been unmasked by the courage of a rejected woman, and that was hard to swallow. It was much easier to laugh at her soaked clothes, to whisper about her loneliness, to question her motives. After all, if she had saved the boy, what had the others done? Nothing. And that stung. Dot. The next day, a child asked her mother. Why? No one had helped. The woman said nothing. Another man muttered, "That was widow business. Shouldn't be imitated." But someone, an old fisherman, said quietly as he adjusted his net, "Sometimes the ones we look down on have the cleanest hearts and went back to work. Like someone who knows too much truth makes people uneasy." Makina's dive remained in the village's memory, like a collective wound. No one dared speak much of it, but everyone remembered. It was like an echo that lingered over the place. The sound of her body cutting through Theriver, the silence that followed, the life that came back. And that echo, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it, had already sunk deep into the village's soul. Because courage, when seen up close, shines in a way no lie can ever dim. When Jabari opened his eyes for the first time after the drowning, the sky above was no longer the same sky from the festival. The blue was denser, heavier, as if time itself had held its breath along with him. The boy coughed slowly, his throat burning, eyes still foggy. Marina held his body gently yet firmly, like someone cradling a cracked vase, knowing that any sudden movement might let the pain spill out again. She didn't speak. She simply adjusted the blanket around him, pulling it up to cover his small feet. Her hand, calloused by years of hoeing, scrubbing, and abandonment, now rested on the boy's fragile chest. Feeling each heartbeat weak, but alive, that's when she cried. Not like someone mourning a loss, but like someone who's found something they thought was lost forever. Her tears made no sound. They simply fell, dampening the child's forehead, a kind of baptism made of pain and rebirth. The village had already dispersed. Some pretended they hadn't seen anything. Others whispered from across the square, but there on the damp grass by the riverbank, there were only two bodies, and a silence full of meaning. Makana held Jabari like a mother who didn't give birth. Through her womb, but through her actions, she looked at him with the deep eyes of someone who knows what it feels like to sink, not in water, but in the absence of affection. And now in that small body, she saw a chance to save not just a life, but her own soul. The boy was breathing with difficulty. Each breath was like a stubborn gust of hope. Marina then reached into her bag and pulled out an old blanket. She used at home on the coldest nights. She gently covered his body, feeling the warmth slowly return. Then she made space on the grass, lay down beside him, and pulled the boy closer. It was a natural gesture, as if that embrace had been waiting for a child who never came. She began to hum an old lullaby her grandmother used, toasing when she was a girl, a song that spoke of healing waters, of arms that protect, of angels that live among the humble. The melody was barely a whisper, but the wind seemed to carry it gently as if each word was stitching the world's wounds. And as she sang, her chest softened, because in that moment, even without witnesses, Makina was whole. Night fell slowly, tinting the sky in shades of memory. Jabari was already asleep, his face serene, his breathing more steady. Marina still watched him like someone tending to Asmal flame that could be extinguished by any breeze. She didn't move, didn't want to return home. She stayed right there beside the boy like a forgotten but vigilant sentinel. It was the first time in many years that she felt needed, and that need was a balm. In the early hours, someone passed along the road and saw the scene, the widows leaping upright, the boy wrapped in her arms. Later, they said it looked like a living sculpture, the kind old folks carved to tell stories of courage and sorrow. Others whispered she'd been possessed by a river spirit. But an old pastor, upon hearing these stories, simply said, "She's carrying the boy's heart with hers. That's why it started beating again." When the sun rose, painting the village in gold, Marina was already on her feet. She washed her face at the riverbank unhurried. Then she picked up Jabari in her arms and walked slowly to his mother's house. The woman opened the door with hollow eyes, the kind that have cried too much. When she saw her son, she screamed, wept, embraced him, then froze when she looked at Marker. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She took the boy and shut the door, as if the life returned to her hadn't come from the hands of the woman everyone had learned to ignore. Makina stood there for a few seconds. Her body ached, Her heart did too, but there was something different in the air. She had felt chest beat again. She had heard the most powerful sound in the world, the sound of life returning, and that even without gratitude, even without recognition, was more than enough, because those who have died inside know exactly what it means when someone comes back to life. On her way home, a little girl followed her. She didn't say a word, just walked behind her in short, careful steps. When Machina stopped to fix her sandal, the girl came closer and asked in a small voice, "Are you magic?" Machina looked at her, smiled softly, and replied, "No, child, I just jumped." And she kept walking. Because sometimes what seems like a miracle in other people's eyes is simply the reflection of someone who has too much courage to wait for someone else to act. Dot. And so between one heartbeat and the next, Marina slowly began to feel her own heart beating again, not because of the village, not because of applause, but because for the first time in many years she remembered she was still alive. And life, even in solitude, was still hers to live. The sun kept rising in Kagiso. The roosters still crowed right, on time, and the chapel bells echoed on Sunday mornings as always, but something in the air had changed. It wasn't visible or tangible. It was a feeling scattered like the smell of smoke after rain. The village seemed restless, not on the outside, but from within. There were too many stares and too few words. The silence wasn't the usual kind. It was the silence of those who had seen something they couldn't explain, let alone accept. Dot. Since Makina's dive, conversations at the well had grown shorter. The women who swept the square avoided talking about the day of the drowning, as if mentioning it might unleash more uncomfortable truths. The men who once spoke loudly and acted like guardians of courage now exchanged glances when walking past the widow's house. There was a collective discomfort, but no one knew what to call it, and for that very reason, everyone disguised it with the easiest weapon. Disregard dressed up as normally. Some, however, could no longer pretend the shoemaker's daughter who had seen. Marina, come out of the bushes carrying the boy, told her mother she looked like a statue of light. "I've never seen anything so strong." But the mother, unsure how to respond, simply told her to fetch water. Old Baba, who always sat under the cashew tree to tell stories, now murmured to himself, "Theriver doesn't take those who still have a mission," and no one dared disagree. It was as if he knew something more. Other tongues, though, were sharper. Madame Nalia, the one who led the hymns and made sure her voice was heard, whispered during the women's meeting. Marina did something noble. Yes, but maybe just to be noticed. Widows craving attention often make grand gestures that others simply nodded, some in agreement, some avoiding confrontation because deep down, even those who criticized her knew what Makina did wasn't ordinary. And that was exactly what stung. Dot. At Sunday Mass, the priest didn't mention her name, nor the boys. He spoke of miracles, of faith, but the sermon felt incomplete, as if everyone was waiting for him to say, at least once, someone jumped. But the omission was strategic. To name Machina would be to admit that the Ville's heroine was the very woman they had all forgotten, and that for many was just too hard to swallow. Still, there were whispers, soft voices in corners, uneasy hearts. Some women began to look at Machina with a mix of admiration and shame, as if recognizing the worth of someone they had once rejected. One child said, "Mommy, she looks like a grandma from a pretty story." And the mother, touched by the simplicity of the words, was left speechless. The elder Kofi, who rarely spoke, chose to break his silence in front of a group of young men, mocking Machina's courage. He looked them in the eyes and said, "You laugh because you're afraid to see clearly." The water brought back someone everyone had forgotten to look at. And that, my children, is stronger than any speech. Then he fell silent and walked away slowly, like someone leaving a truth behind. At Makina's house, nothing had visibly changed. She still gathered herbs, still sweat in silence, still swept the yard with short steps. But inside her, something was already different. When she walked to the market, she could feel the eyes landing on her back like blackbird feathers. And though no one greeted her directly, they no longer ignored her as before. There was now a weight to her presence. The woman everyone had tried to forget had suddenly become impossible to overlook, that the children were the first to draw near. Jabari, of course, always bringing her flowers, smooth stones, dry leaves, gifts from nature, as if trying to thank her with the purest things the world had to offer. Then came others. A girl asked Marina to tie her hair. A boy wanted to know what it was like to swim in the river. Machina never said much. She just smiled and said it had to be done. And in those few words, an entire universe of quiet courage unfolded. Yes, the village was divided between those who still believed a widow should be a shadow, and those who had started to see light, where once there had only been dust. The division wasn't loud, but it was real. And inside each home, each heart silently chose a side. The side of wounded pride or the side of well-earned recognition. Machina never asked to be seen. She only did what she believed was right. And now, without speeches, without demands, without asking for anything, she began to teach the village something it would never learn on its own. That a person's worth doesn't lie in the place they are given in society, but in the courage to rise when no one else will, and that even to those who refuse to admit it, is impossible to ignore. In the days that followed the rescue, the villagers' routine seemed to return to normal, at least at first glance. Women went back to sewing on their porches, men to digging in the soil, children to running through the red dirt paths. But there was something in the air, a strange lightness, as if the silence that once surrounded Marina had lost some of its grip. She still walked alone, still received no invitations, was still avoided by many, but the disdain no longer held the same weight. Now it was like a cracked wall still standing, but no longer unbreakable. It was on a Thursday morning when the sky was still covered in gray clouds and the scent of rain lingered in the breeze that something unexpected happened. Machina had woken up early, as always, to gather herbs from the small garden behind her house. Her yard was modest but fertile. Everything there grew with quiet strength, just like her. She picked the leaves carefully, cleaned them with her fingertips, and tied them into bundles using old strips of cloth. It was her livelihood, her way of continuing Dot. But that day, before she finished tying the bundles, she heard a different sound from the front of the house. Footsteps, firm, purposeful. She approached the window slowly, lifting the edge of the straw curtain, and there, standing outside, was the village. Chief Mumba, a man of few words and a stern expression. He had never knocked on her door, never even offered a nod. Yet there he was, holding a folded cloth with something steaming inside. Marina opened the door cautiously, not afraid, just guarded. The wind tossed her graying hair, and the wrinkles on her face looked carved in stone. Mamba didn't speak at first. He simply extended the cloth, revealing a steaming clay mug, hibiscus tea from the smell, sweetened with honey. A simple gesture, but in his hands it was an offering. "It's for you," he said, his voice dry. "We usually give this to those who do, more than what's expected." Machina didn't know what to say, not because she lacked words, but because anything she could say felt smaller than the moment deserved. So she simply took the mug with both hands, lowered her head slightly, and stood there, her eyes full but not spilling. The steam from the tea rose between them like a veil, separating the before and the after. Ma's gesture spread through the village like fire through dry grass. Not because it was grand, but because it came from someone who never showed affection. Tuan Yuan. The tea mug became a topic of conversation, treated like a sacred gift. Some said the elders had order at it. Others claimed he acted on his own after hearing his daughter pray for Marina. Some even whispered that he'd had a dream where the river called him by the widow's name. No one knew for sure, but everyone understood that after that gesture, something truly changed. The women who used to avert their eyes now passed Markina with a gentle nod. The children who once whispered now smiled openly. A young man even asked for one of the medicinal plants from Haryard. He said it was for his grandmother, but his eyes said something else. They said respect. And for the first time in years, Makina began to be treated as a living part of that place, not as a remnant, but as a root. She never boasted, never told the story aloud, never asked for recognition. But in that warm tea, served without pretty words, there was more than sugar. There was forgiveness. There was gratitude. There was the restoration she never demanded, but fully deserved. And for a woman like her, that was enough. That night, Makina sat on the porch bench, mug in hand. It was already cold, but she held it, as if it was still warm. She looked at the moon through the dry branches of the mango tree and thought of the husband who never came back, thought of the child she saved, thought of the words that never came and Theons that came too late. And in that sweet silence, she understood that some victories don't make noise, but they take up permanent space in the soul. Because sometimes what seals a new beginning isn't a celebration or a hymn or a statue. It's a mug of tea placed in the hands of someone who for far too long only knew how to carry weight. And that in a village so quick to judge was more than enough to begin learning how to recognize true worth. It was late afternoon when Jabari appeared at Makina's house for the first time since the dive. In his hands he carried a small, smooth stone, the kind the river leaves on the shore like a memory. He held it carefully as if it were a precious gift, and knocked on the door with the hesitation of someone who didn't yet know what they could ask for, but knew at least that someone on the other side would listen. Makina opened the door slowly, her face still damped with the sweat of work, and when she saw the boy standing there, her heart beat in a different rhythm. "It's for you," said Jabari, extending the stone. "I found it where you pulled me out." Makina took the gift with tenderness. The stone was cold, but her hands were warm. She looked into the boy's eyes, and there she saw something no one else offered her: truth. Jabari, with his whole innocence, was the only one who didn't need to pretend, or hide or measure his words. They sat on the doorstep side by side, like two accomplices in a secret only they understood. After a while in silence, the boy spoke. "I heard you before I saw you. The water pushed me, but it also whispered like it was saying you were coming, that you already knew." Makina looked at him with gentle surprise, not because she doubted it, but because she recognized it. She knew that life sometimes walks paths that adults forget how to follow. Children, on the other hand, still hear what isn't said, and in that simple phrase, there was something deeper than any speech. "The water called you auntie," Jabari went on. It didn't call anyone else. She didn't reply right away. She just looked out at the dirt road, listening to the birds settling into the trees, feeling the breeze on her legs. Then, without turning to him, she said quietly, "Maybe the river knew I needed to be called back too, because inside I'd been drowning. For a long time." Jabari rested his head on her shoulder and closed his eyes. A small gesture, but full of bond. Makina embraced him gently, like someone holding something precious. And there, in that embrace, both were healing. Because, while he was reborn from death, she was reborn from being forgotten. In the days that followed, the boy returned more often, always with a story, a found object, a phrase that only made sense to those who knew how to listen to the invisible. He shared dreams where the river was a road of light, said he could hear the sound of the water even when far away, and always at the end of each visit. He said with conviction, "The water knew it was you." Marina began to understand that this boy brought more than gratitude. He brought a purpose. Every Time she heard him speak, she felt more alive. It was as if each of his words stitched back together a part of her that had been torn. And it wasn't just because he had seen her as his savior. It was because he saw in her what no one else did. A whole woman needed present. Dot. One afternoon, when she offered him a piece of cornbread, Jabari gently refused and said, "I didn't come for food, Auntie. I came because here my chest feels calm." Makana smiled, squeezed the boy's hands, and said, "And you, son, are the voice I thought I'd never hear again." The bond between them soon became a topic in the village. Some began asking if she intended to adopt him, if she wanted to raise him. Others said it was dangerous for a lone woman to grow attached to a boy whose mother was still alive. But none of it touched them because what they had wasn't a plan nor a duty. It was connection. It was soul recognizing soul. In the village, no one questioned it anymore. There were still whispers, but even those grew quieter, because where there is truth, lies have no place to root. And over time, what started as gratitude became routine. Jabari came often, sat often, spoke often, and Makana, who once could barely remember what it was like to hear someone say her name, now heard it frequently, and more than that, with affection. One night, as they watched fireflies by the edge of the woods, Jabari said something she never forgot. "One day, I'll be Big Auntie, and when they asked me who taught me to listen, I'll say it was you because before you saved me, you were already hearing me." Mina felt the tears come, but didn't let them fall. She just held him tightly and thought, sometimes God answers our prayers through small voices. Sometimes redemption comes in the form of a barefoot boy with a heart full of light. And in that moment, she knew with a certainty that no longer needed proving that of all the voices in the world, Theon she most needed to hear was his. The one that said, "The water called you," and finally she had answered. It was on a stifling afternoon, the kind where the sky looks blurred by heat, that the news reached Makana. Someone knocked at her door insistently. When she opened it, she found the villager's young teacher, Ao, standing there, her clothes wrinkled, her face marked by worry, and a yellowed sheet of paper in her hands. The riverside school, where the children learned to piece words together and make sense of the world, was falling apart. The roof had collapsed from the rain, the chairs were broken, and the lack of supplies made the notebooks seem like relics. "We need help," Auntie Makana said. "Ao," her voice steadier than her frame. "The children like you, and maybe you could read with them, tell stories, teach what you know." Marina stood in silence for a few seconds. She looked up at the sky heavy with clouds, then down at her dirt-covered hands from working the fields. She didn't see herself as a teacher, not as someone who had anything to teach. She had spent so long being silenced that she had forgotten what it felt like to hear her own voice with meaning. But there was something in that young woman's request, and something even greater in the eyes of the children now gathering near the fence, that sparked a forgotten ember inside her. "I don't know how to teach the way you do," Cher replied almost in a whisper. Io smiled, a simple smile like someone building a bridge. "Teaching is sometimes just being present." That same week, Makina began going to the school, not as a teacher, not as a student, but as someone who carried stories folded into her skin. She would sit beneath the mango tree on a little wooden stool and wait for the children to arrive. Each brought something with them, a question, a stone, a crumpled piece of paper, a fear, and she, with the patience of someone shaped by time, would listen, respond, and tell. She told stories of the time when rivers still spoke to fishermen, of how you could hear Thoraine's arrival in the bird songs, of how a word, if spoken kindly, could be nourishment. The children, shy at first, were soon enchanted. They laughed. They asked questions. They begged for more. And Makina, who had thought life had forgotten her, realized she was still a source. Slowly, the school began to recover. Ao secured donations. Parents began helping with what little they had. The roof was repaired with palm leaves and creativity. And at the heart of it all was Makina's steady presence, her attentive gaze, her hands that moved as if planting words in the air. There was a girl, named Ziri, who always sat beside her. She was quiet, withdrawn, rarely spoke. But when Makina told the story of the woman who spoke with the waters, Zuri raised her hand and asked, "Have you ever spoken to the river?" Makina looked into her eyes, unhurried. "The river spoke to me first. I just learned how to listen." The answer became a seed. The children began to look at the river differently, and more importantly, they began to look at Makina with reverence. Not the reverence of fear or obligation, but of affection. They began to call her the Aunt of Words, and that title, simple as it was, meant more than any medal. Bit by bit, the village began to notice. Mothers saw their children speaking of Makina at home with joy. Fathers, once indifferent, started showing up to school meetings, and Io, already admired by many, became even more respected for having extended a hand to the woman everyone thought had been forgotten. One afternoon, after an improvised lesson on medicinal plants, a boy came up and said, "Auntie Makina," my grandmother said, "your voice sounds like her grandmother's." Makina smiled. That was it. Her voice wasn't new. It was old. It was the echo of all the women who had cared, taught, and comforted. Her voice was a bridge between generations. And in that role, storyteller and keeper of memory, she had finally found her place, not as a shadow, but as a root. In the final week of school before the summer rains, they held a small celebration. Nothing grand, just a circle of children with flowers in their hair, singing a song they had created themselves. It was a simple melody with verses about courage, the river, and the heart. At the end, Makina was called to the center of the circle. Zuri, with a trembling voice, handed her a necklace made of seeds and said, "This is so you never forget that we hear your voice." Makina wept, not from sadness, but from a deep recognition, because for a long time she'd been silence, and now she was sound, she was voice. She was Songdot in that school of mud and soul where learning came from ancestral wisdom and everyday love. Marina found something she thought she'd lost forever, her presence in the world, and there among patched-up notebooks and curious eyes. She was no longer a sorrowful memory till she had become a beacon. There was an old saying in the village, "When drought enters your home, even pride begs for water." And maybe that's why on a morning with a cracked sky and hardened earth, the woman who had most scorned Marina showed up at her door, not with superiority, but with hesitation in her eyes and dust on her feet. Her name was Nalia, one of the most influential figures in the community. Known for her sharp tongue, upright posture, and a gaze that swept the village square like judgment. For years, she'd been among the first to turn her face away whenever Mashina passed. And now, there she stood, clutching the scarf on her head tightly, like someone who needed to hold on to something. Marina showed no surprise. She simply opened the door and pointed to the wooden bench under the shade of the cashew tree. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't move away. She just waited for the silence to take shape. Nalia sat slowly. Her eyes were red. It was unclear whether from dust or from shame. She stared at the ground for long seconds before lifting her head and saying, "The water in my well dried up, and the maize didn't grow this year." Makina remained silent. She knew there was more behind those words. Nalia hesitated. Her voice wavered. "I came to ask what you would do with this dry land, with this sky that doesn't answer." Makina rested her elbows on her knees and laced her fingers together. She looked out at the horizon, where the wind carried dust and a hint of hope. Then she turned her eyes back to Nalia and said, "A dry heart doesn't water a harvest." The sentence fell between them like a stone in a still river. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a sermon. It was a truth from someone who had learned to survive in the scarcity of everything: water, affection, recognition. Nalia didn't argue. She swallowed the silence like someone drinking bitter medicine. "I didn't come for revenge," Machina continued, "and not to see you suffer either. But it's good to feel what it's like to be ignored. Sometimes that's the only way we learn to see with less hardness." Nalia nodded slowly. There was a new kind of weariness. In her eyes, not physical, but moral. For the first time, she seemed to see Marina not as a threat or a shame, but as a woman who had suffered, who had fallen, who had been cast aside, and yet still rose to save a child that wasn't even hers. "I thought you were weak," she confessed, quietly. "That you'd lost your mind when you jumped into that river." Machina gave a faint smile, not one of pride, but the kind that knows the bitter taste of judgment, "and I thought you'd never have the courage to look me in the eye again." The two sat there in silence, listening to the dry birds of midday, feeling. Time stretched slowly. It was a simple moment, but full of weight. Because not every reconciliation begins with an embrace. Sometimes it starts with humility, disguised as a question. After a while, Machina stood, walked into the yard, and returned with a handful of leaves from a plant she used to purify the soil. She handed them to Nalia without ceremony. "Mix it with ash and water, and when you spread it on the land, talk to it. The earth listens to those who speak with truth." Nalia took the bundle with trembling hands. She nodded in thanks and turned to leave. But before walking away, she looked back and said, "I'm sorry. It was quick, but enough." Emma K. didn't reply with words. She simply went back inside, leaving the door open, and returned to doing what she always did, tending to life. Because those who have learned to live in silence don't need an audience to know when they've been heard. In the days that followed, Nlia's crops began to show signs of life. Not much, but enough to feed. And more important than what sprouted from the ground was what sprouted within her. She began to walk differently, to speak less, and listen more. She started sitting with the elder women, listening to the children, respecting the rhythm of things. And when she crossed paths with Machina at the market, she no longer turned her face. She gently touched her shoulder and said, "May your harvest be good." Just that. But for those who knew Nalia, that was almost a miracle. Machina, for her part, held no illusions. She knew the world doesn't change overnight. But she also knew that sometimes a small seed grows deeper than a large one. And in that visit, in that question, in that apology, there was something more valuable than justice. There was repair. And for someone who had been erased for so long, that was like water in the desert. In the village of Kugiso, time wasn't measured only by the turning of the sun, but by the cycles of the land. After the rainy season and long days of silent waiting, the first crops began to appear. Corn, pumpkins, cassava swollen like the arms of a strong child. It was a sign that the great harvest festival was near, an ancient ritual where songs echoed until dusk. Fires lit up the courtyards and stories flowed like tamarind wine. It was also when the village's youth symbolically represented the cycle of life. And this year something unprecedented happened. Jabari was chosen as the lead shepherd boy of the celebration. The boy who had once nearly drowned in the river was now the symbol of a new season. Many agreed with the choice, though some still thought it too bold. They said it was risky to place such spotlight on a boy so marked by fate. But the elders knew the river hadn't just returned Jabari's life. It had delivered a message, and it was right. that this year the boy walk at the front of the procession holding a green branch in his hands as a sign of renewal. Days before the festival, Jabari appeared at Makina's house with a special request. He knocked on the door with a serious face and dust-covered feet, holding a bundle of dry leaves and bits of vine. "Auntie, can you help me make my costume?" Marina smiled. She had known this moment would come, not from prophecy, but from faith. Faith that the boy she had saved was meant to show the world something greater than himself. She led him to the back of the house, opened an old wooden chest and pulled out a thick, worn cloth, one she used on heavy work days. "This has been with me a long time," she said. "It protected me when life offered only thorns. If you wear it, it'll protect you too." Jabari took the fabric with reverence. He ran his hands over the rough weave and smiled, eyes shining. Together they transformed that cloth into a kind of cape, with straw stitched along the edges and seeds, sewn across the chest. It wasn't as pretty as the other children's new clothes, but it had soul. And when he put it on, he looked like a king of the earth, dressed in ancestral dignity. On the morning of the festival, the village woke to the sound of drums and the smell of fresh porridge and corn cakes. The children lined up barefoot and adorned with flowers in their hair. When Jabari arrived wearing Makina's humble cape, a respectful silence fell. There was no luxury in his garment, but there was history, and that in that place spoke louder than any ornament. During the procession, he walked at the front with steady steps, a calm gaze, and the green branch in hand. When he raked the center of the circle, where all eyes were fixed on the youth, he did something unexpected. He stopped, raised the branch high, and pointed to Makina, sitting off to the side in her usual quiet spot. "This woman," he said, his voice rising beyond childhood, "taught me to choose love over fear." The words sliced through the air like a sharp arrow. Many didn't know where to rest their gaze. Some eyes brimmed with tears. The scene was simple, but it carried centuries of reckoning, centuries of forgotten women being remembered, of rejected hearts being embraced. Marina didn't rise. She didn't cry. But her hands resting on her lap trembled like leaves in a storm. In that public recognition, she felt something she no longer expected to receive. Sincere applause, not for a single heroic act, but for the quiet constancy of a whole life. And the people clapped, not only for Jabari, but for the story behind him. The applause began timidly, then grew stronger. And when the drums sounded again, something had truly changed. Makina, once a forgotten presence, had become a symbol. Not a symbol on a pedestal, but one held in people's hearts. The children looked at her like one looks at a sturdy tree. In the middle of a drought, the adults saw her through a different lens. Even the proudest among them lured their eyes. That day, Marina didn't receive a title or a medal or a fancy speech, but she received something no ceremony could ever offer: her place back in the world. Jabari, with his child's voice and spontaneous gesture, did more for her than any authority ever had. And there, in the heat of the celebration, between harvested grains and shy embraces, the woman who once dove into the river discovered she had planted more than courage. She had planted remembrance, and remembrance when watered with truth. Blooms were once there was only forgetting. Every year after the harvest festival, the village of Kugiso held the field mass, a ritual that joined faith and gratitude, where families brought baskets of their first fruits. The elders sang ancient hymns, and children ran between the makeshift benches built from logs and colorful cloths. It was a mass without grandeur, but full of soul, one that didn't need cathedrals, because the land itself became an altar. That year, however, there was a different energy in the air. The songs began as always, steady voices, hands clasped, eyes lifted to the sky. But between each prayer, Between each offering laid at the center, there was something unspoken that everyone felt. Makina's name echoed, even without being said aloud. It was as if every note carried a piece of her story, as if finally the village was recognizing, even in silence, how much she had been reborn. And it helped others be reborn with her. The sun was strong, but the wind blew gently. The trees around seemed to listen, and Makina, seated once again in a quiet corner, observed in silence. Her feet were grounded in the earth, her lap draped in a white cloth, her gaze fixed on the improvised altar. She expected nothing. She had already received more than she ever imagined. She just wanted to be there, present, feeling the weight and lightness of being seen. It was during the final prayer that something happened. Elder Kofi, the one who rarely spoke in public, rose slowly. He walked to the center of the circle with the help of his wooden staff and asked for a moment of silence. What followed was deep, not tense, but still. It was the silence of true listening. When he spoke, he didn't need to raise his voice. He simply said, "We've all harvested something this year. Corn, beans, stories, life. But there's a fruit that few recognize and one that must be celebrated. The fruit of courage." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd, to the one who jumped when no one else stood, who heard the river's call. Andre turned to the village what we, ourselves, had forgotten. Our gratitude, without saying her name, he pointed to Makina with a slow, steady, ceremonial gesture. The eyes turned toward her, not with haste, not with shock, but with reverence. For the first time, Makina was not looked at with pity or curiosity or doubt. She was seen with dignity. Young teacher Ao stepped forward with a woven basket and placed it at Makina's feet. Inside were small tokens made by the children. Drawings, seeds, crooked lettered notes, flowers picked on the way. It was a symbolic gesture, but full of truth. A child approached and read aloud, "Miss Makina, you jumped for us. Now we walk for you." Makina brought her hands to her face. The tears came not from sorrow, but from deep acknowledgement. It was as if everything she had carried for years, the abandonment, the rejection, the silence finally poured out through her eyes, washing away the pain, leaving only what mattered. A strong gust of wind blew, and a white cloth from the altar lifted into the air, floating toward her. Makina caught it gently, like catching a sign. The fabric fluttered in her fingers, and for a moment it felt like the whole world was breathing with her. In that quiet gesture, the village found redemption. The drums began again slowly, not as loud celebration, but as a heartbeat, an ancestral rhythm that said without words, "We see you now." And Makina, without saying a thing, stood. She walked to the center of the circle, looked at the faces around her, and simply nodded. It was enough. The people responded with a new kind of silence, not of judgment, but of respect. There in the middle of the field, with her feet on the soil she had always tended, Makina was at last restored, not as a heroine of a single act, but as a woman who endured, who waited, who kept goodness lit inside her, even when no one else lit a candle for her. And when the Mass ended and the paths home reopened, someone whispered softly, almost like a prayer, "May God give us Makina's courage and the humility to recognize it before it's too late." And so among songs and tear-filled eyes, that year's field, Mass was forever marked. Not for its abundant harvest, but because in a land once dried by old neglect, the rarest thing had finally blossomed, a silent tribute. Marina never asked to be remembered. She didn't beg for recognition, nor did she try to mold her pain into speeches. She simply lived like so many women in the silence of long hours, in the small gestures, in the days when solitude feels like the only faithful companion. And even so, when fate grew strong and an innocent life slipped beneath the river's surface, It was her heart that heard. It was her body that moved. It was her soul, already tired of waiting for comfort, that leaped without hesitation. The rejected widow became a beacon for those who felt invisible. Her quiet courage spread like a breeze through the homes, slipped through half-open doors, whispered in kitchens, and stirred the names that had long been erased from people's hearts. Because in saving that boy, Marina didn't just return one, life to the world. She gave hope back to every woman who had been dismissed as the end of the road. Jabari, the child she pulled from death, grew up with her voice inside his steps. Every time he neared the river, he said he could hear the water calling. But now it called for something else. To remember, to recognize, to make sure the righteous were never forgotten. He began repeating to the younger ones what he had learned without ever needing. Books that courage doesn't always look like a sword or a shout. Sometimes it looks like a quiet woman with wrinkled hands, walking alone through the village dust, carrying inside her a storm of faith. And he said, with certainty, Auntie Machina saved me, but she also saved the dignity of those who thought they had no more place in this world. The village, flawed as it was, learned in time, learned not to let a good soul wither into forgetting, learned that words can hurt, but silence can be just as cruel, and that sometimes what looks old to hurried eyes is actually root. Deep root that holds Marina began to be invited to baptisms, to council circles, to rites of passage. Her voice, once ignored, even out of pity, was now sought with respect, and still she never changed her way. She kept rising early, watering herbs, weaving her leaves, sitting on the bench under the cashew tree. She remained herself whole despite everything. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all, that you don't need to shout to leave. A mark you just need to act with truth. In the end, when time took her, there was no frantic crowd, no loud mourning. There was a simple ceremony full of wild flowers and children's songs. And on that day, by the river where it all began, Jabari, now a grown man, spoke firmly, eyes on the water. She wasn't just the woman who jumped. She was the one who stood when no one else had the courage. And so Machina's story didn't end. It echoed. It echoed in every woman who'd ever been ignored, in every gesture that once seemed too small, in every silent sacrifice because her life became a story told around fires, a seed stored in the village's memory, a faith restored where once there had only been doubt. And when people ask, even today, who saved the boy that day, the elders don't just say her name. They say with reverence she saved a life and the dignity of those who thought they had no more place in this world because her courage was more than a moment. It was a calling, and that calling even now can still be heard by the riverbanks, as if the water whispered day after day. There are those who love in silence. There are those who fight without sound. And there are those who deserve to be remembered forever. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our